Life, culture and current events from a biblical perspective. 2020 with Neil Johnson on Vision.
We're going to connect with an organisation today that was founded as far back as 1874. You may be aware of the words of Jesus, who said, "Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse those with leprosy. Freely you have received, freely give." Well, believe it or not, leprosy still poses a problem in some nations. And while there are some modern treatments, the aim for a leprosy-free world is still the focus of the Leprosy Mission in Australia. The Australian team is part of a 30-member alliance worldwide. Andrew Newmarch leads Leprosy Mission in Australia. He's joining us. Andrew, welcome along to 2020.
Thanks very much, Neil. Yep.
Andrew, World Leprosy Sunday is coming up. Give us some insight here into how you keep this focus alive.
Well, we want to make sure that people remember that leprosy is still an issue, even though it isn't in Australia. It is in other countries in the world, and it's something that affects people for a long time and in many different ways. And so we want to try and make sure that we have a special focus on leprosy so that we can bring that to people's attention and they might be able to support the work that we do.
So for us Aussies, out of sight, out of mind. But as you remind us, it still is there in a lot of countries around the world. What's the current state of leprosy in the developing world?
Yeah, well, there are three countries where this is a particular issue. India, Brazil and Indonesia are the three countries that have the most people who are affected by leprosy. We're looking sort of around 200,000 plus people each year that have leprosy. And some of the numbers are a little bit wonky at the moment because statistics were very hard to keep accurately through the COVID period. And sometimes it's hard to get all the numbers correct anyway, because often these people are in very poor situations and very remote locations. And so it's hard to capture everybody, as well as the fact that health systems in many of these places are also very poor and the statistics aren't kept well. But we're looking at least around 200,000 people a year.
Well, in biblical times, Jesus healed the lepers, and we've got some fairly straightforward medical treatments today. What is the reason, do you think, that leprosy is still such an issue in these nations?
Well, I think partly referred to the fact that many of these people live in remote locations. But one of the other ones is that there's no vaccine. Many other diseases have a vaccine for them. And for example, with COVID, we're able to develop that very quickly. But there is no vaccine for leprosy, even though there are medications that can help cure it, but it can't prevent it at this point of time. So that's a really big issue, and that's apart from the health systems that I mentioned previously, where back in around 2000, there was a drive by the World Health Organization to eliminate what they call leprosy. And many countries actually did that, but that's 1 in 10,000 people. But the problem was that as many countries sort of got to that point where they could state, oh, yes, we've eliminated according to that definition, people sort of backed off from working on it to completely eradicate it. And so it continues to be an issue. And the other problem with it is that leprosy incubation can take a long time, in some cases up to 20 years. And when you think of that with relationship to COVID, where it's a couple of weeks, that's an enormously long time to try and keep on top of a disease. So that's a big problem.
Here we are in 2023 and all of the technology, the medical developments, other significant changes or developments that you can see on the landscape so far as treatment for leprosy?
Well, certainly a big development occurred around about 1980 or through to 1982, which is the production of antibiotics and a combination of 3 antibiotics that helped to, that we now call multi-drug therapy. And that helped to bring people to a point where if they took it, they would not be contagious, say, within 48 hours. But they would need to take those drugs for quite a long period of time, depending on the type of leprosy that they had. In some cases, perhaps 6 months. In other cases, up to 12 months. And for the majority of people with leprosy, they were kind of cured. But part of the problem is that it's not just about treatments for the leprosy, it's also about discrimination and stigma. And in some cases, that's almost worse than the disease itself. Neil, I wanted to tell you a story, and your listeners a story, of another type of activity relating to leprosy that picks up this idea of stigma and discrimination, but also where we've sort of dealt with election issues. Now, this might be quite a surprise to your listeners that we've affected democracy in Nigeria. And the reason is this, that in Nigeria, if you want to vote, you have to provide thumb and fingerprints. And so many people with leprosy or skin diseases can't do that because their fingers have been damaged. Now, a consortium of disability organisations that included the Leprosy Mission lobbied the government to develop an option. And that's resulted in the Nigerian Electoral Commission introducing facial recognition. And you might think, oh, great, that's all fixed now. But the problem was that electoral office staff in general carried many misguided and inaccurate ideas about leprosy, and they wouldn't go near the people with leprosy. So training was required to change those people's mindsets. Now, we've been able to do that. We've got a project in Nigeria that's largely funded through an Australian government grant, and we were able to support the training of electoral officers. And that was launched by the acting High Commissioner from Australia, and was relayed on national television. And this has made a huge difference because electoral officers understand that they can approach people with leprosy without fear. And members of the general public who saw that television broadcast are also, and they might be queuing up to register, they also know that they don't need to fear. So this has been an extraordinary development from our point of view and from the people with leprosy in Nigeria and the Electoral Commission. So in some ways, this is your listeners' taxes in action. And we've been able to influence really good democracy processes in Nigeria. So we're pretty excited about that.
Who would have even guessed that what we might even think about as an ancient disease might have such major ramifications here in a modern context in an African nation? And with a election that's coming up in Nigeria, 25th of February, undoubtedly, we'll be thinking that the Leprosy Mission had a role in helping to make things go smoothly there. Hey, when we talk about
your tax-paying listeners,
that's right. Hey, Andrew, so far as Leprosy Mission goes, I mentioned it's a really old organisation, 30 different departments around the world. How do you reflect on being part of such a wonderful, historic organisation that you are?
Yeah, I think I'm really privileged to be operating with Leprosy Mission. And one of the really big issues for the Leprosy Mission's founders and subsequent leaders has been the idea of prayer and praying for the work. I think one of the big shifts that's occurred in the history, though, is that we have a situation where in the past, because there wasn't medication, it was all about treatment and caring for people. And often the health systems in many countries weren't in operation. And so it came back to churches and non-government organisations to provide that care and treatment for many people. nowadays, because we've got this MDT that I referred to earlier on, and also because there are national health systems in place, the role of Leprosy Mission is changing. It's no longer, the only repository for people to go to get care. And more than that, the drugs that, or the MDT drugs, can only be supplied through the government. So there's big shifts that we need to think through how we are able to operate effectively. And so some of that might be to be involved in research or to think of new ways in which to find people with leprosy. It might be, for example, through sort of doing tests through schools and assisting education departments and health departments to do tests through school kids and teachers, and then find kids who might have a positive response, and then sort of do contact tracing, something we're familiar with COVID, back into their households and communities, and so find other people. So there are a number of ways which we have to think about how we shift the way we do things because of the changes since the beginning. But still, one of those key things is prayer. That's been a standout kind of component of the Leprosy Mission from the past, and it still is.
Well, over a 150-year history, you might be almost the victim of working your way out of a job because you've been successful in what you're doing. As you're saying, you've got to look at new ways to see the organisation continue to flourish and to continue to make that really huge difference in the lives of people, and especially in those nations that you mentioned, those three nations, India, Brazil and Indonesia, which are the focus for your work as it stands. Hey, how do our listeners get involved with Leprosy Mission? Is there some way we can connect with you and be involved?
Well, I just mentioned prayer, and I think that's one aspect, so people can pray for us. But clearly we need funds to do things, and so people can donate to us, and we have a website that people can go to, and there are a number of different ways in which people can donate through that website. For example, you can contribute just to general donations, or there's some specific projects, the government-funded ones that we have need what we call match funding. We have a shop, and the proceeds from that go into supporting our work. And there are some scholarships that we've got for people who've been affected by leprosy. So those are possibilities. I think one other one that we would also want to promote is the use of the word leper. We don't use that word anymore, and we try to put the person before the disease and say people with leprosy rather than the word leper. So that helps people to think about leprosy in a different way as well. Yep. Well,
you've done wonderful work and you've got your hand to the plough. There are all sorts of big initiatives that are still ahead of you. And for listeners to connect with a wonderful organisation, Leprosy Mission, there is a website. Let me point listeners to leprosymission.org.au, leprosymission.org.au, and you'll be able to connect with Andrew Newmarch, who leads Leprosy Mission in Australia. Andrew, thanks so much for giving us an update and sharing those insights with us today on 2020.
Thanks very much, Neil. Appreciate that.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.